The intellectual impoverishment of the left. In my introductory essay, Growing Up Left, I contrasted right and left, liberal and progressive, liberal and conservative, and expressed a few thoughts on privilege and discrimination. The left arose as a populist movement, one that challenged the existing societal hierarchy and leadership based on appeals to authority, grounded upon hierarchy and power, that of the church and the aristocracy. Instead, the left in their better moments and over the long term embraced Enlightenment values. Prominent amongst them, appeals to authority based on reason. This characterized the rising mercantile bourgeoisie class, whose very existence was one of continual negotiation as they sought to expand their markets, and even more so of the natural philosophy, that is to say, science and medical disciplines, that had found safe haven in the universities. The triumph of free markets and liberal democracies over the authority of the church and nobility came largely not through force, rather initially as a steady intellectual movement that sought more general education and the enfranchisement of more and more of the population, with the intent of an increased self-determination for themselves and their communities. The elimination of serfdom, chattel slavery, indentured servitude, the suffrage of women and minorities, the protections and rights afforded workers. All of these and more are victories on the left, built largely upon successive appeals to reason, with a respectable track record of reliance upon force only when absolutely necessary. It's not as if the left were formally more educated than the right. That was certainly not the case historically, as education was a privilege of the church and nobility. The right, by and large, looked down upon the populace, the unwashed masses, as certainly ignorant, if not utterly deplorable. They wouldn't imagine sharing authority with such common people. There was, of course, a sense of responsibility towards the lower classes. A basic level of care was exercised towards them, but any thought that they could have a meaningful contribution to the dialogue of societal organization was considered quite beyond the pale. This low opinion was undoubtedly confirmed during the French Revolution, where as the commoners seized power, all hell broke loose and blood filled the streets for years. Nevertheless, subsequently, the left learned to be patient in granting enfranchisement over successive generations, largely through programs of education incorporating persuasion through reason. The bastion of the left's authority became the university. The university was a place where you came in with your provincial worldview and had it dashed to pieces against the bulwark of reason. It was a place where everything you were raised to believe and hold dear was challenged through dialogue and debate. A place where you were no longer taught what to think, rather how to think. That was the purpose of the university, and particularly the core curriculum of liberal arts, to prepare young men, to free them psychologically, so as to be contributing members of society, whatever that might entail. Yet, in my lifetime, the offerings of the liberal arts have taken a disturbing turn. Much of the university's programs and resources today are devoted to professional workforce training. Fair enough. However, the remaining core curriculum of liberal arts is anything but liberating. The very commitment to reason that made the university we know today possible is often vilified as just another instrument of power and oppression. In the place of reason, the various silos preach their ideological commitments. The drawing out of the potential of the individual has been largely replaced with indoctrination into the collective of a favored identity group, of which the student is prepared to be an activated avatar of the chosen ideology. Speech and dialogue, once thought of instruments of reason for free individuals to work out their differences without resorting to physical force, are likewise condemned as nothing more than instruments of violence in the hands of oppressors. The possibility of striving towards at least a provisional truth or consensus between conflicting views through dialogue and speech is denied, and speech labeled hateful or offensive is suppressed. So what has speech and dialogue been replaced with? For the most part, memes. Memes are short for memetic viruses, or rather, viruses of the mind, a pre-existing concept Richard Dawkins articulated as such in the early 1990s, with an emphasis on how oversimplified ideas might spread socially using the analogy of viral transmission. Of course, we've recognized memes by other names for quite some time. The propaganda of the early 20th century, short ideological phrases easily propagated to the masses through public relations, infamously utilized by the Nazis and Soviets, but still very much with us, conspicuously so in the advertising world. Slogans, literally the war cries of the dead, ideological imprints that long outlived their progenitors. The slogans of the architectural community, form follows function, and less is more, continue to wreak havoc on the built environment, for example. Memes, propaganda, and slogans are typified by a few characteristics. They're vague or ambiguous, that is to say, they have unclear meaning or could be interpreted in a number of ways. They're not dependent on reason or evidence, logos, credibility of the source, ethos, but instead strictly belief, conviction, and commitment, pathos. And clearly they have to be simple enough to be easily transmitted. Best if they're devoid of intellectual content, as cognition arrests transmission. I've always had a healthy resistance to manipulation. I especially don't appreciate the shallow attempts of memes that are nearly or entirely devoid of intellectual content. That this now appears to be among the principal strategies of the left is both surprising and incredibly disappointing. I'd like to exhibit an example in the purported banner for the resistance, going over each meme individually. Love is love. In philosophical terms, this is what is called a tautology, except it's somehow not quite. A tautology at least compares two apparently different things, showing them to be in fact equal, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4. This meme is just simple repetition. A moment's reflection shows the complete emptiness of the phrase. Any meaning can only come from what the reader projects upon the meme. Different readers can repeat love is love with deep emotional fervor, yet have completely different associations for what love is or what they feel they're expressing about it. Essentially, it becomes a contagious meme that conveys a false sense of unity based on nothing. Black Lives Matter. Here, the explicit meaning is obvious, and therefore trivial. Of course Black lives matter, because human lives matter. The implicit meaning, or better said meanings, are at the very least ambiguous, and again have a lot to do with personal projections. I'll follow up with a few common implications. Black lives matter less than those of other racial groups to those other racial groups. Black lives matter less than those of other racial groups to institutions. Black lives matter more than those of other racial groups, period. To be charitable, I might suggest that this is an attempt to isolate racial discrimination, which in practice is difficult to do, as human beings tend to participate in a smorgasbord of discriminatory categories simultaneously. Not only race, but also age, sex, education, wealth, attractiveness, intelligence, etc. I would say that it would be common to find someone not black that faces more discrimination than someone who is black. However, the implication is that all other factors being equal, black lives matter less than those of other races in our society. Philosopher Daniel Dennett recently coined the term deepity to describe this sort of pseudo-profound phrasing, of which we'll encounter a number of them on this banner. Climate change is real. Again, the explicit meaning is obvious. As with metabolism or life, change is wrapped up in the very definition of climate. I suppose one implied meaning might be that humans are responsible for detrimental change to the environment that is resulting in unnatural changes to the climate. And fair enough, admitting there is a problem is a good first step to addressing it, although those that would deny such climate change are now in the minority, and I find this meme, printed en masse on toxic polyethylene banners, won't go far in convincing them of much. No human being is illegal. Yet again, the explicit meaning is obvious, and therefore trivial. The implicit meanings surround immigration and refugee policies, and again suffer from ambiguity. Is this implying a need for a clear immigration policy? Should there be a more open immigration policy? Or perhaps should there be completely open borders dispensing with immigration policy altogether? When this phrase is chanted, it's easy to imagine there is a wide range of interpretations as to what is meant. Women's rights are human rights. The last of the deepities. Similar to Black Lives Matter, the explicit meaning is obvious, and therefore trivial. Of course, women's rights are human rights, as women are humans. Yet again, we're confronted with the ambiguity of the phrase, making possible a variety of implied conclusions. Women have inferior rights than men. Women have some rights that are different from men. Women and men should have exactly the same rights. Women should have superior rights to course correct for past inferior rights. Who knows? Everyone just takes their pick, I suppose. All genders are whole, holy, and good. A slogan. The change in tactics is almost refreshing. Almost. This one is a bit more complicated, as 4 things are being said. 3 separate characteristics being applied to gender, and then something implied about gender itself. So what is meant by gender? Biologically, with extremely rare exception, we're dealing with 2 genders, male and female. How gender has recently been defined attempts to include social constructs, such as how a person identifies themselves, typically male or female with some exception, and how they express themselves, again, typically as male or female with some exceptions. Regardless, upon a moment's reflection, I don't know if a gender is good or bad. It just seems to be. I'd have to really have a clue as to what is being said here before I could even think of agreeing with any of it. The new credulity. However, I don't think it's the understanding of the aforementioned memes that's being expected, neither agreement per se. I find it interesting that as Western civilization becomes increasingly secular, the religious impulse of man does not appear to be diminished in the slightest. What seems to be expected by the left appears to be the ritualized recanting of the new catechisms, summaries of the tenets of belief, such as those expressed on this banner, or as a bumper sticker, or yard art before the faithful. How are you viewed if you say, "Sorry, I just can't accept that," or "No, thank you, I'd never put that in my yard"? Or maybe just, "Can we talk about it?" Talk about it? Unlikely. Is there really anything to discuss with a sexist, racist, homophobe, a sinner? At the very least, if you disagree, hold thy tongue. Dare not speak of it. We've entered a period of superstition, a nouveau taboo. There are new sacrileges and blasphemies, words you're forbidden to say, and entire subjects that are off limits. And certainly there are shunnings, brandings, and excommunications for those who transgress the holy rites or desecrate the sacred icons. Increasingly, scientists such as biologists and psychologists are being branded as such heretics. Among them, lifetime academics whose personal sympathies lie deep within the left, yet whose scientific research yields uncomfortable results that contradict the confessions of faith. Then there are the apostates, children like myself on the left, brazenly critical of the new credulity. There is simply no hope for a former believer who has willfully turned aside. Well, I like certainty on this point, but I have my doubts that the current coalition of the intellectually vapid can hold. Much of the memes above appear to hinge on a disposition to the world, and Western civilization in particular, as a killing field of injustice, towards the earth, towards women, towards blacks and minorities of all kinds. The cultivation of such an attitude seems to me to be more seething resentment than any true pursuit of fairness. Intellectual content aside, the left has become, in my view, a bitter, mean-spirited movement. Perhaps a subtle shift of tone could heal it, though, a spirit of charitableness and generosity, towards the earth, towards women, towards men, towards blacks, towards whites, simply towards one another. My belief is that in doing so, we might just reap a bounty of gratitude.